So last week we did Judas. We finished Judas's suicide. So tonight we'll start the trial before Pilate this evening. But in any case, let's begin by reading. Let's read from St. Matthew's Gospel and then read the parallel accounts from Mark's, Luke's, and John's Gospels. They're all a little bit different, either in detail or in emphasis. Let's just read verses 11 through 14. And then if we get beyond them, we can read those as we get to them. So, chapter 27, verse 11. Now, Jesus stood before the governor, and the governor asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus said to him, "You have said so." But when he was accused by the chief priests and elders, he made no answer. Then Pilate said to him, "Do you not hear how many things they testify against you?" But he gave him no answer, not even to a single charge, so that the governor wondered greatly. Let's take a quick look at Mark chapter 15, verses 1 through 5. As soon as it was morning, the chief priests, with the elders and scribes and the whole council, held a consultation. They bound Jesus and led him away and delivered him to Pilate. And Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And he answered him, "You have said so." And the chief priests accused him of many things. And Pilate again asked him, "Have you no answer to make? See how many charges they bring against you?" But Jesus made no further answer, so that Pilate wondered. In Matthew, he's amazed. Here, he's only wondering. The parallel account in Luke is chapter 23, verses 1 through 5. Then the whole company of them arose and brought him before Pilate. They began to accuse him, saying, "We found this man perverting our nation and forbidding us to give tribute to Caesar, and saying that he himself is Christ, a king." So we have more detail on the charges. And Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And he answered him, "You have said so." And Pilate said to the chief priests and the multitudes, "I find no crime in this man." But they were urgent, saying, "He stirs up the people, teaching throughout all Judea, from Galilee even to this place." Then John chapter 18, verses 28 through 38. Then they led Jesus from the house of Caiaphas to the praetorium. It was early. They themselves did not enter the praetorium, so that they might not be defiled, but might eat the Passover. So Pilate went out to them and said, "What accusation do you bring against this man?" They answered him, "If this man were not an evildoer, we would not have handed him over." Pilate said to them, "Take him yourselves and judge him by your own law." The Jews said to him, "It is not lawful for us to put any man to death." This was to fulfill the word which Jesus had spoken, to show by what death he was to die. Pilate entered the praetorium again and called Jesus and said to him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus answered, "Do you say this of your own accord, or did others say it to you about me?" Pilate answered, "Am I a Jew? Your own nation and the chief priests have handed you over to me. What have you done?" Jesus answered, "My kingship is not of this world. If my kingship were of this world, my servants would fight that I might not be handed over to the Jews. But my kingship is not from the world." Pilate said to him, "So you are a king?" Jesus answered, "You say that I am a king. For this I was born, and for this I have come into the world, to bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth hears my voice." Pilate said to him, "What is the truth?" After he had said this, he went out to the Jews again and told them, "I find no crime in him. But you have a custom that I should release one man for you at the Passover. Will you have me release for you the king of the Jews?" They cried out again, "Not this man, but Barabbas." Now Barabbas was a robber.
Man, it says Barabbas was a revolutionary.
Yeah, often translated robber, but revolutionary or social bandit or bandit is more
Okay.
more appropriate.
Yeah, mine says insurrectionist. What a difference.
Yeah, he either was a revolutionary, he either was, well, in some ways it's a fine line. We discussed social banditry, I think, a couple of weeks ago. But a social bandit is someone who sort of lives on the margin of society and commits acts of banditry, particularly against, the wealthy or against those in power. So, in English literature, the classic example of a social bandit is Robin Hood. And although Robin Hood is fictional, the that kind of character is very, very common. In fact, that sort of character is sort of endemic to peasant society, and especially to peasant societies that are sort of experiencing economic crisis, and particularly experiencing intense exploitation as Palestine did at the hands of the Romans. So he's not, robber, kind of implies an ordinary criminal, which he's not. So insurrectionist, revolutionary, although that probably may be too strong in the sense that, revolutionaries typically have a revolutionary agenda, and that's not necessarily the case. But insurrectionist, revolutionary, bandit, if we understand that as being a social bandit. We'll discuss more about Barabbas when we read Matthew's account. But we notice that John's account is very wordy, with a lot of exchange between Pilate and Jesus. In chapter 26, verse 65 and 66, Jesus has been charged with blasphemy. So why is blasphemy not mentioned here?
The Romans didn't care about what the Jews felt about blasphemy because
Right.
it's against the Jews.
Right,
Yeah, so it would be waste of time.
right. Pilate could care less about blasphemy. He could care less about internal Jewish affairs. So what does he care about?
He cares about anyone that wants to be a rival to his king.
To Caesar, yeah.
Right.
But he didn't see Jesus as a threat to Caesar, did he? It didn't seem that he saw that as a threat.
Well,
mean, I wasn't there, but it just seems that things that's written down, it seems that Barabbas was more of a threat to the Romans and the Jews, you know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So Jesus is handed over. He's clearly in John, the fuller list of charges with, refusing to pay taxes to Caesar, et cetera, indicates, the focus of, in some sense, what is said in verse 12. But when he was accused by the chief priests and elders, he made no answer. So Pilate begins by asking Jesus, "Are you king of the Jews?" And that question is significant. And then there come accusations by the chief priests and elders, and those, if we sort of move to John's gospel, all focus on political charges that would amount to impeding or obstructing or disturbing political order in the empire. So that's something that Pilate has to take very, very seriously. So he asks the question, "Are you king of the Jews?" Does anyone remember that phrase by any chance?
Is that the one that they received him when he entered the city? They would say the king of the Jews, right? No, they would say no, they didn't say that. No.
No, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord.
Exactly. Yeah.
So the one who comes in the name of the Lord. The king of the Jews is used once in chapter 2, verse 2 by the Magi. It says, now when Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, "Where is he who has been born King of the Jews?" So it's an interesting question to ask in Jerusalem when Herod is in power, because Herod is King of the Jews. And now Pilate is asking, "Are you King of the Jews?" The last king of the Jews was Herod. His children did not become kings of any region. They simply became kind of administrators, but were subject to Caesar. They didn't have any real autonomy.
And the Herod that beheaded the head of John the Baptist?
Yeah.
It was
Yeah.
Herod Antipas. It was one of the children of Herod. He had 3 sons. One was Philip, one was Herod Antipas, and I don't remember the name of the third. So Pilate asks, "Are you the king of the Jews?" But if we look a little bit later, jump ahead to verse 17. When they had gathered, Pilate said to them, "Whom do you want me to release for you, Barabbas or Jesus, who is called Christ?" And then again, in 22, Pilate said to them, "Then what shall I do with Jesus, who is called Christ?" Does anyone see the significance of that?
Can you repeat that, Ron, quickly? It's like,
Okay, in 2:2 and in chapter 27, verse 11, we have the phrase King of the Jews used. So it's a phrase used by Gentiles. And it's a phrase that gets Herod's hackles up. It's a phrase that Pilate has to take very seriously because there is no king but Caesar. But then in verses 17 and 22, Pilate addresses Jesus as Jesus who is called Christ. Does anyone have any sense of what that suggests? So Jesus who is called Christ, Jesus who is called the Messiah.
when they're called Christ, when they call Jesus Christ, it's more related to the religion, right? Because the Jewish people was waiting for somebody to, I don't know, they thought it was, no, because they thought it was going to be like, they're all getting with guns, like, fight. So they wouldn't be under the regime of the Romans anymore.
I mean, you can see it. You can see Messiah in a number of ways. You can see it as a king. You can see it as a priest. You can see it as a warrior. You can see it as a king priest. You can see it as a king priest warrior. But fundamentally, it's a Jewish conception.
Mm-hmm.
King of the Jews is not particularly a Jewish conception. It's
Okay.
a king
It's more like
who happens to be Jewish, but and that's unacceptable because the king is Roman. The king is Caesar. So there can be no other king. So Pilate changes the phrase and switches from King of the Jews, which is a Gentile phrase, and not particularly a phrase that a Jew would use, to Jesus the Messiah or Jesus Christ, which is a phrase that a Jew would use, which indicates, first of all, that Pilate, despite all of his limitations, has done his homework, and that even at this early stage, in all probability, Pilate thinks Jesus to be innocent.
Yeah.
We also have an element of certain irony here, or reversal, in verse 11. Now Jesus stood before the governor. So the governor is seated. He's the one with authority. And yet Jesus will ultimately be seated as judge of the world. So the judge is the one who will ultimately be judged, and their roles will be reversed. In the second part of the Olivet Discourse, in chapter 25, verse 31, Jesus says, "When the Son of Man comes in his glory, and all the angels with him, then he will sit on his glorious throne." So the one who will sit on the throne is now standing and being judged. So there's an element of irony, and there's an element of role reversal there. There's also an element of prophetic fulfillment. You remember in the missionary discourse in chapter 10, starting in 17, Jesus says, "Beware of men, for they will deliver you up to councils and flog you in their synagogues, and you will be dragged before governors and kings for my sake, to bear testimony before them and the Gentiles. So Jesus is sort of the first fruits of that prophecy. He's being dragged before the governor. So on the whole, ostensibly the trial of Jesus, and yet there's very little detail about the trial. There's Pilate asking him, "Are you king of the Jews?" Then there's the sentence. There's no real clear judicial proceeding here. In the midst of a lot of detail, what is the issue that Matthew is trying to raise here?
Regarding the trial?
Yeah, throughout this section, the trial of Jesus, it actually starts with Judas, in verse 3, with Judas hanging himself and trying to return the money to the treasury, and then it goes on to Jesus' trial. So beneath the sort of narrative of events, the question that he's asking really is, who is responsible? Who is responsible for convicting an innocent man, sentencing him to death, and executing him?
Well, we know it was Caiaphas, right? No,
What?
it's not that simple. Caiaphas was the one that conspired against him.
No,
No,
it's not that simple.
it's not that simple.
Yes, Caiaphas is certainly guilty, but so is Pilate. So is
So is the
crowd.
people.
What?
No, I was going to say, so is the people.
Right. Yeah. And what's striking throughout this narrative is that only the people who are ultimately being misled by their leaders are willing to take responsibility. And so,
But none of them are trying. None of them are taking responsibility, correct?
right, none of them are.
Yeah.
Right. The Sanhedrin isn't willing to take responsibility. Well, Judas actually recognized that he betrayed innocent blood.
Yeah.
The Sanhedrin, even though they instigated the whole thing,
Mhm.
nevertheless recognize that this is blood money,
Yeah.
but so they buy the potter's field with it, but that's an attempt to give to charity to keep themselves clean, because they're pointing the finger at Judas and not at themselves.
Mhm.
And then we talked about when we earlier when we were discussing delivering Jesus to Pilate in verse 2, Matthew uses the phrase Pilate the governor, and he periodically simply says the governor. He uses the phrase Pilate the governor, and there's an element of irony there, that Pilate isn't behaving very much like a governor. And the governor is supposed to, he's presiding over a judicial proceeding of a man who he knows is innocent. His responsibility as a governor who's presiding over a judicial proceeding of a man who he knows is innocent is to find the man innocent. But instead he washes his hands. But he can't, but he's not, it's a meaningless gesture. So he's guilty too. So everybody here is guilty. Does that make sense?
Now,
Yeah.
applying a little bit like the fact that the gospel is kind of like not time, like time doesn't apply as much. Are we also guilty for the death of Christ in terms of
No,
like the people?
no. I mean, in Christian history, in a lot of Christian interpretation until, quite late, it was argued that Judaism was, condemned permanently because the Jews killed Christ. There was really a heavy element of anti-Semitism there, but that's not really Matthew's message. I mean, he is saying that the participants are guilty. He is saying that the leaders are guilty and that they've misled the people who follow them. And he is saying that there will be condemnation upon temple Judaism. I mean, that the first element of that actually starts, going back to with the Magi. In chapter 2, verse 3, it says, when Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. So, it sort of pits Jerusalem against especially Galilee and conceivably even the rest of Judea. So Jerusalem is the center of the temple. It's the center of temple Judaism. And it's there particularly that people fall under the influence of the temple elites, the Sanhedrin, the chief priests. And so that is condemned, or that will fall under condemnation. But it's not a blanket condemnation of everybody that then gets passed on forever and ever and ever. That really isn't Matthew's message. But at the same time, I mean, in a lot of ways, the message is the same as the creation story in Adam and Eve. Nobody wants to take responsibility. Everybody engages in self-deception and tries to do whatever they can to pass responsibility on. And so that question of a responsibility, I mean, less than for ourselves, less than raising the question of are we responsible for Christ's death, which we're not. There is a question of, are we willing to take responsibility for, the things we've done, for the consequences of our own sin, for even sin that results, as it did from Pilate, for being caught in an uncomfortable situation in which he had to make, in which he ended up making some bad choices that he shouldn't have made, but it's also understandable that he did make them. So in a lot of ways, I mean, this is, although the consequences are less drastic, we're not murdering the Son of God. To what extent do we ourselves not take responsibility for the things we do? And that's a very, that's a very human tendency to try to evade responsibility. There are a bunch of charges. So Jesus' response to Pilate, "You have said so." What did he mean by that?
Well, didn't it simply mean that he didn't call himself king, but someone else called him king? Pilate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yes. So Pilate has unwittingly spoken the truth.
I never thought of that, but that's right.
And in all probability, Pilate sees this guy brought before him. And so Jesus is meek, he's quiet, he doesn't behave in a manner that one would expect. He says, "You have said so." He's then silent in response to the accusations of the chief priests of the Sanhedrin. Then in verse 13, and Pilate said to him, "Do you not hear how many things they testify against you?" So he's expecting that Jesus is going to have some sort of response. And Jesus doesn't. And it says that this translation said the governor wondered greatly. Other translations say marveled or was amazed. And the implication, the Greek word used is thaumazo, which has a connotation of being favorably impressed in Matthew's gospel. So the same word, you remember in chapter 8, Jesus marveled at the centurion's faith when the centurion said, "When I give a command, what I say is done. If I say go, they go. If I say come, they come. And you can do the same." And so Jesus marvels and says he's never encountered that level of faith in all of Israel. The same word is used when the disciples marvel at Jesus calming the storm later in chapter 8. It's also used when Jesus heals the mute demoniac in chapter 9, verse 33, where when the crowd says, "Never before has anything like this been seen in all of Israel." It's also used again in chapter 15, verse 31, of the crowd marveling at Jesus' healings of the mute, the maimed, the lame, and the blind. It's used in chapter 21 with the withering of the fig tree. And it's used in chapter 22 of the Pharisees marveling at Jesus' response about the paying of taxes, that he wiggled out of the trap that they set for him. So why is Pilate marveling? There are a number of possibilities.
He was expecting Jesus to say, "Yes, I am. You're right." But he didn't say that.
If he actually said, "Yeah, you're right," then he's probably admitting to a capital offense. So "you've said so" is a much better response, because it puts it back on the questioner. But the big thing is that, so this is a capital trial, right? So it's a question of whether crucifixion is going to be imposed as the sentence. And so typically people in capital offenses aren't quiet. You're expected to defend yourself. I mean, nobody wants to die, or most people don't want to die. So, and crucifixion is a really horrendous way to die. And it's preceded, as it was in the case of Jesus, by flogging, which, is not, the whip was, it's not simply lashes with a whip. Pieces of metal or bone are attached to the end of the whip. And so the lashing tears flesh. It's, in some cases, people actually die during the whipping before they can even be crucified. So the flogging is itself very serious. So, and then so that's excruciating, and then it's followed by an excruciating death on the cross. So nobody simply wants to endure it. So you're, expected to, so you can be expected that you're going to fight tooth and nail to make sure that this doesn't happen to you. And given that, Pilate was noted for cruelty, it's, probably likely that he probably even enjoyed, sort of the sparring and conversation and trying to, dig the person who he's judging deeper into the pit, sort of playing with them like a cat might with a mouse. So that's one thing, that the behavior is just incongruous. I mean, why would somebody do this? And then the second thing is that, I mean, in some ways related to that, is that, we have this kind of grandiose charge. Here is this guy who thinks he's the king of the Jews, or who says he's the king of the Jews. And so you look, and what do you see? This meek person who doesn't look like he's the king of the Jews, and doesn't look like he's a king at all. So in that sense, Pilate may be amazed because of sort of incredulous contempt that Jesus is too impotent to be dangerous, too meek to be dangerous, and too meek to be a king of anything. So ordinarily, silence would lead one to assume guilt, which is the case in Roman law, that those who don't defend themselves are guilty. But here, Pilate doesn't take silence as an admission of guilt, because it's so incongruous, and what he's seeing in front of us himself is so much in conflict with, what he would ordinarily, with the picture of a guilty person. So does that make sense?
Yeah.
Why he's amazed?
Yeah, I think it does. Yeah.
So then, why is Jesus silent?
Well, doesn't Jesus already know that he has to do this? He has to be killed to fulfill the him entering heaven.
Right.
So yeah, so he maybe that's why he doesn't truly defend himself.
Yeah, so he has decided to let events run their course.
Wonderful. Yeah.
If we compare um, his response to Caiaphas earlier, we're in chapter 26, verse 64. Caiaphas in verse 63 says, I adjure you by the living God, tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God. Jesus said to him, you have said so, but I tell you, hereafter we'll see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven. So we have the same, you have said so. But then we have sort of the additional detail and explanation of how his messiahship, his vision of the Messiah differs from the Sanhedrin's, which in turn digs him deeper. So here, he doesn't do that. He just says, you have said so, probably because he sees no point in trying to explain how his kingship is no threat to Rome, or how his kingship isn't what Pilate imagines, that there's just no point, and that events should run their course. Is there anything else, though? The silence?
I was thinking his silence wasn't just for Pilate, but for the Sanhedrins too, because if he had responded to Pilate, then the Sanhedrin would say they were right, that he is blaspheming against them or something. No, am I saying it right?
Well, remember that Pilate wouldn't be concerned with blasphemy. I mean,
Oh, well, I mean that the Sanhedrin turning him into Pilate because of not saying or saying that he was the king, that it would make them, they're turning him over, right, to turn him over. Say that twice, didn't I? I'm not making myself clear.
right, if he said to the Sanhedrin that he was king, then they would simply turn him over to Pilate and say he said he was king. But he said he was Messiah, or I mean, he attributed the vision of the Son of Man coming on the clouds of glory to himself, which is, leaves very much open the question of the relationship of the Son of Man to earthly kings. So, so his response before Caiaphas was clearly much more openly blasphemous than, claiming kingship for himself. I mean, it is claiming a special relationship with God, a unique relationship with God, and a fulfillment of Daniel's prophecy, but it's not so clearly, claiming the role of political king. So given that, the Sanhedrin, having been accused of blasphemy, the Sanhedrin, sort of has some work to do to come up with credible grounds for accusing Jesus before Pilate in terms that Pilate is going to find acceptable, given that he could care less about, squabbles among Jews, or, different interpretations of Judaism and the Jewish religion and of the Hebrew scriptures. All of that stuff is, just totally of no interest to him and of no interest to Rome. It's only when something becomes a threat to political power and to order in the empire that Pilate is really going to be concerned. But Jesus clearly doesn't want to defend himself and doesn't want to get into it. There's also, Jesus also doesn't respond because he is the suffering servant. Let's look at, again, at some of the suffering servant prophecies. First of all, Isaiah chapter 52, starting at verse 13.
Yeah, so see, my servant shall prosper. He shall be raised high and greatly exalted.
Mhm.
Even as many were amazed at him, so mad were his features beyond that of mortals, his appearances beyond that of human beings. So shall he startle many nations. Kings shall stand speechless, for those who have not been told shall see. Those who have not heard shall ponder it.
Mhm. Right. John quotes the first part of John quotes verse 13. Behold, my servant shall prosper, he shall be exalted and lifted up, and shall be very high. Where is Jesus lifted up and very high?
On the cross?
On the cross, right? So notice, kings shall shut their mouths because of him, for that which has not been told them. So what he doesn't say, they will see. And what they don't hear from him, they'll understand. So Pilate asks, are you the king of the Jews? And Pilate describes him as the Christ or the Messiah. Jesus doesn't say it, but eventually it will be seen and understood. Also, Isaiah 53, verses 7 and 8. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. Like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, and like a sheep that before its shearers is silent, so he opened not his mouth. Actually, we can, read on a bit. By oppression and judgment he was taken away. And as for his generation, who considered that he was cut off out of the land of the living, stricken for the transgression of my people. And they made his grave with the wicked and with the rich man in his death, although he had done no violence, and there was no deceit in his mouth. What do people do when they defend themselves? They typically lie. There is no deceit in his mouth. And then finally, one more verse from Isaiah. We have read this a long, long time ago. Isaiah 42, chapter 42, verse 1. This was one of Isaiah's fulfillment quotations earlier. Behold my servant whom I uphold, my chosen in whom my soul delights. I have put my spirit upon him. He will bring forth justice to the nations. He will not cry or lift up his voice or make it heard in the street. A bruised reed he will not break, and a dimly burning wick he will not quench. He will faithfully bring forth justice. So not cry or lift up his voice or make it heard in the street. Bruised reed he will not break, a dimly burning wick he will not quench. Quiet and gentle and meek, Jesus as the suffering servant.
Can we say, Ron, that Jesus was in control to the whole judgment? Or no?
Hmm.
He was, right?
Yeah.
Even though he didn't say anything or he was just offering himself up. At the same time, he was in control of the whole situation,
Hmm.
like just using the other people to make God's will, really.
Right. When I mean
Using,
the
yeah, using. I wouldn't subscribe to the word, using. Every other person that did whatever they did out of their own free will, and they had the choice to actually do right, but they decided to do whatever it is, they chose to. So the word using the author for me is not really right. He didn't use anyone to do anything. What do you think, right?
No, when I say using, it's not the fact that like using, like no, like it's like you said, even though they have the free will,
Yeah,
but the
allowing them to
choices that
do
they made, which was not
right.
good ones,
Yeah.
it still serve the purpose of like humankind salvation, even though could be different, wasn't, but at the end,
so there's the element of mystery here that in the end God turns evil into good, and it's not that evil becomes good, it's that by some path that we can't foresee, good results from
From
evil.
Mhm.
But none of that absolves anyone of responsibility for what they've done. So the Old Testament talks about God using the Assyrians or using the Babylonians to bring judgment. But at the same time, they end up being condemned because they brought judgment. They behaved like conquerors, which, they behaved like conquerors behaved. And so they were accidentally fulfilling the will of God. But the will of God can also be fulfilled in other ways.
Okay.
So that's this is a real weak area for many Christians who think that being used by God is always good, right? So there was a major argument that Donald Trump is being used by
Used by
God.
God.
And I mean, there was one really good video that I heard from an evangelical pastor who, was very upset by the stupidity of that, because it means that if Donald Trump is being used by God, that then what will follow is condemnation, because Donald Trump is not very godly,
Very arrogant. I don't know how God
arrogant,
uses
egocentric,
egocentric, and dehumanizes others.
right, dehumanizes others.
Makes himself superior, and everything he does is always the best. Every other thing any person does is nothing close.
Right. So if he's being used by God, then that means that fundamentally our nation is doomed. has fallen under God's judgment. So Jesus had to die. He let events run their course. And events ultimately, run their course simply because people are who they are. They make sinful decisions. God can see those sinful decisions, not only because God is outside of time, but also because God can see into our hearts and our minds. And very frequently there's the whole Adam and Eve thing where the snake is ultimately responsible, but I'm not. Somebody else made me do it. But there's, events tend to unfold almost with the predictability of a Greek drama. If, you can't see disaster coming, there's something fundamentally wrong. And here, the Sanhedrin couldn't see disaster coming. They should have been able to. They should have recognized that all of their activity violated the Mosaic law that they profess to hold so dear, and yet they plunged on right ahead. So, although they accomplished God's will, they didn't do it because they were trying to accomplish God's will. They did it because they were opposing God's will, because they couldn't have cared less about God, really.